Thank you so much for being here. What a great opportunity to showcase the Royal Aeronautical Society and what we can offer to you and other colleagues. Tonight is not really a lecture. Sorry, anyone who expected a lecture, I'm sorry. And I've tried to put together some thoughts because we've got such a diverse audience, which is so exciting. We've got some of our young students. I will appeal to the young women. We've got people who've got vast experience in the aviation and aerospace sector. So it's very much about my journey, some of my insights perhaps. I can talk to, because I know the Fliers said some of the issues I think in aviation and aerospace, we can do that. And then what I'd really prefer is actually to open it up to questions, because then I'm talking about what you really want to hear about. So anyway, that's what we're going to do, and we'll see how we go. I always put this slide in, particularly when I'm talking to young women, because we've come a long way. Lorna, we've come a long way, haven't we? Some of the thoughts that people had that women couldn't contribute, there you go. Women's limited mental capacity equips them only for housework and child-rearing. Women are incapable of intellectual achievement. Now, granted, that was said a long time ago, but I like to remind people that that's what some people thought. And another one. So can you imagine it? If young women were allowed to undertake tertiary education, the energy needed by the uterus would be diverted to the brain, rendering them infertile. So hopefully that's not what you ladies are facing, but once again, some outdated views there. Anyway, we go on. I put this picture here because in my Air Force career, when I joined the Air Force, and I'll talk a bit about that, women weren't allowed to be pilots because we were women. Also, women weren't allowed to be military working dog handlers. And when I joined the Air Force and went to Toowoomba, where my training was, Toowoomba in Queensland, and that's where the military, the RAF military working dog handler school was before it moved to Amberley. And so I said, well, I don't understand that. Is that because there's not enough strength? Is that what you're saying? And when the sergeant, I asked, got very squeamish and awkward. Well, Margaret, it's actually because of women's menstrual cycle and the dogs won't be able to handle that. That's in my lifetime, but now that's not the case, and this was clearly a wonderful lady sergeant who is in that field. And of course today we actually, as I said, when I joined the Air Force, I couldn't be a pilot because I'm a woman, but it was in 1995 that that was changed, and women are now allowed to be any type of pilot, but it took till 2017 that we got our first lady fighter pilots. And so if we want to explore why that is the case, we can do that if you want. And there's just some pictures now of women in combat. Okay, my father was a navigator in the Australian Air Force. For those, in fact, we're talking 748. We were talking 748? Yeah, okay. So that was taken at the hangar in Sale, East Sale, and Dad had just brought back the first 748 to Sale. So there we go. And just to sort of one of those, another ironies of life, I was on the disposal committee that got rid of the 748. So there you go. Dad, incidentally, Dad also, he flew in the Japanese occupational forces. He flew in the Berlin airlift. So I've been around aviation my whole life. So I just feel it's in the blood, and we all know, perhaps most of us in this room, what that's like. You just can't get rid of it. So this is me as a first-year officer cadet. When I grew up, I've just explained that I was in an Air Force family. All I saw women doing at that time was typing or nursing. And so I had no inclination at all, actually, to join the Air Force. But it was a careers fair in Canberra, which we had to go to. My aspiration then was to be a primary school teacher. That's what I thought I was going to do. And so we went to this careers fair, and I guess the connection was I saw an Australian Defence Force careers stand, and I thought, well, I am bored here because I'm going to be a primary school teacher, so why don't I go and chat to the team? And so then they worked their magic. So for the young people, just be careful, they worked their magic. And they said, well, you could join the Air Force as a supply officer and you could be doing all these amazing things. And I thought, well, actually, that sounds really interesting. So I thought a bit more about it, and I went home and said to my dad, how would you feel if I joined the Air Force? And he went, oh, doing what? Doing what? And I said, well, I'm going to be a supply officer. So he had two reactions to that. The first was, well, they don't take girls on that. And I said, well, they do now, Dad. And the second thing was, for the air crew in the room, he said, well, you know what, the only good thing I've seen come out of a stores depot is a well-dressed officer at 5 o'clock. So I thought, okay, I understand the pecking order now, so there we go. I had some challenges in my life. This was 1995. My husband at the time was a pilot, and he was killed in an aircraft accident. He was the pilot, and I was 6 weeks pregnant with the twins. One of my proudest achievements, I have to say, ever, is my beautiful babies, Alex and Lachlan, and they turned 30 in 2 weeks, so we've survived all of that. Just amazing. And then they're not interested in the Air Force, they're not interested in aviation at all, so I don't know what I've done wrong there. The Pentagon. So one of my roles in my Air Force career, I was on exchange in the Pentagon. And it was an interest, for so many reasons why it was so interesting. First of all, the American force, Air Force, is so big. We get that. The period I was there was 2000 to 2002. So living through September the 11th, I was not in the building when it was struck. I was down at Oklahoma Air Logistics Centre on another task. But, you know, it was the day that the world changed forever. And once again, we can explore that experience, but it was just extraordinary in terms of that experience. I do remember after day 2 at the Pentagon, I was so overwhelmed because I was telling someone today, at the time, I don't know what the figures are today, but there were 13,500 people working in the Pentagon. That was the size of our Air Force. So it was just like the scale of it all was very daunting. And one of the lessons in my life was like, oh my gosh, I'm here, I'm representing my country, I can't go home, how am I going to manage this? And for anyone who's a study of management and that sort of thing, if you've ever heard of Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, okay, one of them is start with the end in mind. Now this sounds a little bit up myself in a way, but I thought, oh my gosh, I have to somehow get through this. How do I do it? So I took myself to a diner, as you do in America, sat there, and I thought, okay, start with the end in mind. So that's one of his principles, start with the end in mind. If you work hard in the United States Air Force, they tend to give you a medal. So I thought, okay, how do I do? I'm going to draft the citation. The role I had was working in the Air Force headquarters supply area and working on a very large supply chain and purchasing transformation program. So working with the United States and industry to transform. I'll give you a couple of examples of what we did. But anyway, I wrote the citation and said this is what she did. And every time it got overwhelming, I would go back to that and say, well, I can't fix the United States Air Force, you know, I can only do so much. So anyway, 2 of the projects, just to give you an example of what we worked on, One was this concept of reverse auctioning. So I don't know if anyone's come across that. What it was very early days, online, where you could put in a bid and say, I can supply to the Air Force X tonne of whatever at this price. And then another supplier would come in and say, well, actually, I can do it lower. And so you would reverse auction the bid to when it plateaued out, and then the contract would be awarded. Great in theory. The US Navy actually employed this technique for ejection seat cartridges. Now, I had just apoplexy. I thought, has anyone spoken to the pilots about this? Can you imagine? And the Air Force was about to, and because the Navy had saved a lot of money in doing that, in that particular contract. So the Air Force was about to say that all procurement had to be done that way. And I said, well, that's just bizarre. You just can't do that. And my boss, who was a brigadier, he said, well, what do you propose to do about that? I said, well, I'll write a paper. So I worked with Rand Corporation and a number of people, but my suggestion was that that's great for commodities, you know, like pens and paper, spare space on transport, but not for safety critical items. That is just crazy. So anyway, then I wrote the paper, because they didn't think I was going to write the paper. I wrote the paper, and then it was like, well, what are you going to do with that? I said, well, I'm going to have to brief the general. And anyway, so I put forward this suggestion that this is not sensible. Now, if anyone's worked with the, particularly the US military, you don't say, this is not sensible, General. You just do what they say. Anyway, they adopted what I had said. Another example was we worked, I'm talking 2002, on an electronic supply chain was the vision. And to start, and quoting the VP from IBM, that was about, it was the Trojan horse into the supply chain to rationalise it. If you could get that front end electronically, you would, so remember, a long time ago, but and we've progressed those thoughts. But it was working with Lockheed Martin to do an electronic online catalogue. So back in the day, most of us in this room would remember, it was always survey and quote, and it would take forever to get the price and blah, blah, blah. And well, hang on, aren't there standard catalogue items that we could actually put online and they could just make a bid? So just some ideas that now, that they were sort of new back then, but some of the things that I did during that time. Great experience, I have to say, just amazing. And really set me up, I think, for my future career. Fast forward, the children are a bit older now. So through all of that, one of the things, so now once again on the personal dimension, can I say that the Air Force has throughout my career been so supportive of me and family life. So I'm now appealing to young people to support you in your endeavours in terms of the demands of the job, travelling, all those sorts of things. And so I always like to acknowledge that, because certainly in this day and age when it's, I still think, a very attractive option for a career in the Defence Force, there's some of the things that people need to think about, because you're devoting a lot of your whole life really, and when you do get that support, you can achieve things. So that photo is of me being promoted to Air Commodore. One of my other favourite roles that I had, I was Commandant of the Australian Defence Force Academy, and so that's the rector of University of New South Wales. So between us, we ran the show. And the best way I felt to describe it was, well, the rector would talk about the academics and what the students would study and what they wouldn't. And that was very much about academic freedom. So that was a very dearly held value that The cadets had academic freedom, so you think about that when they're wearing uniform and they're in the Defence Force. And I would tell them what they had to wear to class, which was uniform. So an interesting year. I started that year with 2 teenagers. I ended up with 1,002 teenagers, and a very interesting year. But I, for the record, am an absolute fan of the institution. It's doing great things. Some of the graduates are now at 2-star and even 3-star level. That's how long the advert has been going, and really producing some great officers. And this is one of my favourite pictures. This was the graduation parade that year, so this is 2009, and Her Excellency was the reviewing officer, and I think she is so inspiring, just amazing. And she was quite excited that there she was, and that the Commandant was a lady officer and her aide-de-camp was a lady officer. So she said, "Margaret, we must have a photo." "Yes, ma'am. We must have a photo." My last role in the Permanent Air Force, I was Commander Joint Logistics. So for those who aren't familiar with the military terminology, Commander is the boss, and Joint is Army, Navy, Air Force, and logistics in this context at the strategic level is a very broad remit, including supply chain, what we call material logistics, so sustainment, and the sort. So in that role, I had a number of responsibilities. I was on the NATO Logistics Subcommittee, and for those who are studies of these things, yes, Australia is not part of NATO, but at that time, Australia was contributing quite significantly in support or with NATO forces in the Middle East. And so we were very well respected and invited to that, and certainly our contribution in a number of things, including explosive ordnance research, and that's why I was sitting on that committee. This photo is taken in East Timor, and it was just an opportunity when I went up there to examine our contractual arrangements supporting our forces in East Timor. But that role was, we did so many things. We had a large transformation program running. There's a theme in my career about transformations. We revised the laydown for distribution and maintenance facilities and functions and the business model. I was able to convince our senior leadership and then government to commit and spend, because the program did go through, something in the order of $1.4 billion in terms of building either new facilities or renewing facilities, and also in terms of a revised business model around how we did maintenance and supply and distribution in the Australian Defence Force. So that was in terms of my logistics career, that job was the pinnacle, really. That's just a list of my jobs. We haven't got time for that. And once again, just a nod to, for those that's Air Marshal Jeff Brown, aka Dog Biscuit, so we can talk about why his call sign is that. But once again, children a bit older, and but a celebration of as I was transitioning out of the Permanent Air Force, which is another nod to how supportive certainly I felt in my career in the Air Force, and that's why I would commend it to young people to think about. My children hate it when I do that. They really do not like that. Okay, so the next role, a big challenge was I was appointed as CEO of Air Services Australia. I think just about everyone in this room would know what that is, but nonetheless our national air traffic management organisation, including our air navigation systems and also our aerospace firefighting service. The nod to that headline is because one of the objectives set by our chair at the time, Sir Angus Houston, was that I was to make sure that it's old in terms of the aviation, because we talked about is there a current aviation policy, but the white paper, aviation white paper, that said we would have one national air traffic, the military and civil air traffic would have one system. So most people would know that system to be One Sky, and during my time we did get into contract with Thales, and just most extraordinary effort on behalf of a national objective. When you think about the complexities of that, I was working very much in a commercial sense, even though Air Services is government owned. I repeatedly drive home is that there is no government money that goes into Air Services, right? It's all funded by the airlines through fees and other income through other services that is provided. And it used to drive me nuts every time I went before Senate estimates. Thank you for your question, Senator. Why am I here? But anyway. But then the contribution from the military was going through the government procurement process. So just think that was very challenging. Yes, I was there for 3 years, tackled a lot of things, trying to move away from things like embracing more space-based systems rather than the traditional terrestrial systems. We made some progress there. A huge growth in air traffic at the time, if you recall, so I'm talking 2012 to 2015, which required us to build in short order, like in 6 months, 3 new fire stations. So there was quite a big growth during that period, and a very challenging role, and we can talk about that some more if you wish. The other case study I wanted to share with you, so after I left Air Services, I continued with a portfolio of board roles. So I was for 9 years on the board of Commonwealth Super Corporation, and looked after the review of the military superannuation schemes in terms of veterans challenging decisions and a whole bunch of things there, and a few other roles. So let's fast forward. Everyone remembers, although I coined the phrase COVID amnesia, sometimes we forget, but I got a phone call from the Chief of the Air Force in March 2021. And Marg, what are you doing for the next 3 months? I said, oh, well, I've got this and I've got that and I'm doing this. He said, okay, well, we really want you to lead this program. It was called the International Freight Assistance Mechanism, strange name, particularly because it was not just all freight, it was air freight. And it was going to be a 3-month proposition, 110 million. And what it was about was when all our international borders were closed, government officials hadn't thought through that 90% of our air freight travels in the bellies of our international flights. People just assumed it was all freighters. So suddenly, overnight, we had farmers, fishers, producers ringing ministers and saying, well, that's great, but how do I get my live rock lobster to China now? So there was a mad scramble to re-establish air routes between our key trading nations to facilitate that. And because it's a West Australian audience, one of my stories is we were talking about GFC this and GFC that, and I looked at one of my team and I said, that's not the global financial crisis, that's the Geraldton Fishing Co-op, and we've got to get all their live rock lobsters to China. So, and once again, we can explore that, but in terms of aviation and policy for aviation for Australia, that whole experience demonstrated how vulnerable we are. Now, that program went on for 2.5 years, and after about $1.7 billion, we moved about $4 billion worth of exports. Everything. Now, I can talk, it's all coming back to me. There's a Celine Dion song. It's all coming back to me now. The trade that Western Australia does in, for example, strawberries. I didn't know you guys grew strawberries, but a lot of strawberries we sent to Thailand. The rock lobsters we've talked about. The other one, reverse supply chain. So I was appointed by the Deputy Prime Minister, and one of my remits was to prioritise freight in the national interest. And so I love those sorts of tasks because it's very ambiguous. So I got to decide a whole bunch of things in the national interest. But one of the priorities that I wanted to share with you, once again, demonstrates just the vulnerability our nation has until it's challenged, was shipping radioactive isotopes from Tokyo here to Perth for the Royal Children's Hospital. And if you don't spoil a good story for the facts, but the half-life is something like 14 hours. So if you think about the flights have got to come from Tokyo via Sydney to Perth, that's a really great logistics challenge. And but we managed, we did it, and with the cooperation of JAL, we worked with JAL for that one, and people on the ground at Sydney Airport. We could get shipments through that place like you wouldn't believe. But wouldn't you know, further the logisticians in the room, every 6 months we had a hiccup, and we'd be on the phones because the transshipment in Sydney just was crazy. What happens every 6 months? Daylight saving. Starts or stops. Well, you're like Queensland, right? But it's like, yeah, so, you know, just some basic planning things. But nonetheless, you just think about it that if we didn't get that through in 14 hours, the shipment was useless, and then children were very vulnerable. So I've got a litany of examples of that where it really exposed this country's vulnerability for a whole bunch of things. And when we finished that program, it was hosted out of Austrade, for anyone who's interested. I was in uniform, more I think because we know planes and our planning skills. I had a very small team of 5 Air Force people, once again loggies who know planes. The rest of the team were public servants, contractors. We had 70 people. I had to, like, if you get me on a good day, I can do a pretty good impersonation of landline, because we had to build the seasonality demand plan around, you know, when is asparagus growing, when is the rock lobsters. I can't do it now, but I could follow the tuna season around the East Coast, about when yellowfin and bluefin came on and what we had to get away. We shipped fairy penguins. That was more a goodwill thing, I think, from Phillip Island to America. So all sorts of interesting stories to tell you there. But once again, you know, it showed us we worked on a commercial basis. We didn't use any military assets. And out of that, there's some lessons, things like open-ended questions. So is it time we talk about whether or not we have a national carrier or not? Which is an interesting debate for those who enjoy that sort of thing. Qantas will tell you that they are the national carrier, but they are not, because it's government policy not to have a national carrier. We can have all sorts of discussion, anyone from Qantas in the room. But during that time, we certainly relied on Qantas a lot. So not just our role in terms of freight, but it's certainly later on with the vaccines, and certainly bringing Australian citizens back. India is one example, but lots of other countries where they did. And of course they were, it was on a commercial basis. But that's one open-ended policy question that I have is, so should we have a national sovereign carrier? I quietly asked that question in the halls of Canberra. Perhaps I'll be a little more vocal. And other things about national resilience and the importance of, for example, air freight and the aviation sector to this country. So interesting times. Who has not heard of the Royal Aeronautical Society? So I don't know how long I need to spend on this. I felt I ought to talk about that and why we're here. Certainly we are the Australian division of the Royal Aeronautical Society, based out of London. It's very big over there, and it's been around for a very, very long time. John, is that right? Yes. So certainly the Australian division is just about to be 100 years old. So, so what we're doing is, my colleague Terry, promoting the society which is promoting aerospace in this country. And very strong lineage to engineering, aerospace engineering, but clearly much broader in terms of the aerospace sector. So as I think I said, I'm not an engineer, I'm a logistician. Terry's a test pilot. So very much broadening the ecosystem, if you like, about what it takes to bring together that whole sector. And clearly, as we're going forward in this current day and age, around the adoption of modern technologies such as drones, uncrewed vehicles, space technology, and those aspects that we're looking to promote. We're very strong on bringing together pathways into the industry, and particularly at the moment we focus on the universities and the students studying in those disciplines. But certainly it needs to be broader than that, and TAFEs with aviation technicians and the like. So anyway, that's what we do. We'd really love you to think about joining if you're not part of the society, and we can talk to you about that after this. And I just wanted to talk about some of the other things I'm doing, just so you can see where it's all come. Well, I think it comes together, but it might seem a little bit disparate. I'm also chair of the Australian Logistics Council. I won't talk too much about that. I'm a director on Sydney Airport, Kingsford Smith. So some really interesting things there in terms of aviation. With the airport, I'm chair of the Safety, Security and Sustainability Committee. What can go wrong there? So a lot of issues that we're dealing with. We were visiting with Perth Airport today, and very similar issues facing the larger airports in Australia, but some interesting things to think about, particularly coming off the back and recovering from COVID. And for those who may be interested, I joined the board in March 2022 when it was privatised. So most people say to me, oh, so you work for Macquarie Bank. Well, that was so last decade. The airport is now privatised and owned by a number of superannuation funds and industry fund managers. So I can also talk about that if you like. And just a couple other things that keep me busy. And I always like to end the formal part on this particular quote. Who doesn't love Amelia Earhart? So the most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity. The fears are paper tigers. You can do anything you decide to do. You can act to change and control your life, and the process is its own rewards. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening, and I welcome any questions.
I was astounded at the transformation of the RAF, who are now a kind and generous employer.
Well, it evolved over time. I've seen a number. I shared with you some of the changes that I've seen in my own career about that, and I think one of the high order of things is your national military must reflect your population, else you're in grave danger of all sorts of things going pear-shaped there when the military gets out of step with national goals and national culture. There's also real pragmatic issues around crewing the Air Force. So we have to appeal to the broader Australian population, and that's really important for the numbers. I can't talk only because I just don't know right now, but the numbers for Air Force, but it's the first time in about 4 or 5 years the Australian Defence Force has grown. And when you see the geopolitical circumstances in which we face, we must have a strong Air Force. Now, one of the stories I talk about is people assume in the military of the military, that the only way you get things done is to yell at people, right? Well, the last time I yelled at anyone, I was a very young flying officer, and it went really pear-shaped. It was just really, I learnt my lesson. If you have to yell at people and order people about, and there is a place for that, I'm not saying you don't do that, but if you have to resort to that, well, that's a very sad day. When I went to Air Services, I learnt that people still to this day have a very strong stereotype about what military people are like and how they lead, and people just couldn't get me, because my approach was, well, let's get there, I don't know everything, I'm going to learn and engage with people and all those things. And talking to the Fliers, for example, because I had a great affinity with them because of the uniform, I think. And they would say to me, well, you're nothing like what we expected. And I'd say, well, what did you expect? And then they go all very mushy, and I said, you expected me to come in here and order you all about and blah, blah, blah. And they went, yeah, we did. So I would say, well, I'm still in the reserve. I'm not in the permanent Air Force, but I interact a lot with the military. I would challenge you that I think it is better, because we've got a more diverse workforce, people of different background, and when you get that, you do get more, and I'm now talking about perhaps mid-ranking up, but you do get better discussions and different perspectives, and we've got such wicked problems to deal with today that we really need to start thinking differently. And with that sort of workforce, we're a really good place for that.
2017 is when our wonderful ladies were able to fly. Did I get that right?
Yes.
What opened the gate there? I'm sure it's complex and all the rest of the bits and pieces. But
Oh, a couple of things. First of all, pressure, public pressure. Why can't women fly? There was a lot of research into, because all the reasons why women couldn't fly. That's why I put that military working dog example. Women couldn't fly because they had no means to go to the toilet in the cockpit. Women couldn't fly because it would affect their reproductive system. Women couldn't fly for a lot of these so-called reasons. So there was a lot of research done to say, well, that's rubbish. That's just rubbish. So there was that, but it was also addressing the concerns, but also that pressure, like, why can't women fly? Women have been flying for decades. And there was just this very firmly held view that women couldn't fly in military aircraft, which took all that time to be dispelled. So that's how that came about, really. It was 1995 that women could fly. It was not until 2017 that we had our first lady fighter pilots. So, but the time between the policy barriers being removed and the time when we actually got our first lady fighter pilots, a couple of things, I make my observations. The first is when I talked to some of the cadets at ADFA, Air Force cadets who were going to be pilots, they did have that attitude. I said, oh my God, I'm looking at the first lady fighter pilots. And they said, no ma'am, no way. We want to be doing a real job. Sorry, fighter pilots in the room. We want to be in a crewed aircraft. We want to be doing humanitarian work. We want to be doing et cetera, et cetera. And colleagues in the room will perhaps also correct me on this, but there was a lot of work done to try and understand, because women were going on the fighter pilot courses, but failing. So they weren't stopped, but they were failing by, the common standard. So then there were questions, well, why is that? And in summary, it was about the training approach used. It was about a different approach to training and for women, basically. And of course now we have, in fact, a lady group captain fighter pilot. So, but it's taken time. So, but that's you've got to say it's been worked through in a very steady, positive way. No one's been given any free ride there. I know there are colleagues that would challenge what I just said then, but it's been a long time in the process and managed, I think, very well.
Where I'm going with this is, if we simplistically went to war tomorrow, and we had civilian contractors supporting the cooking, the facilities and all the rest, nothing wrong with that, but well, what would happen? Probably nothing.
What would happen in terms of what?
In terms of, previously we had all military people servicing the vehicles, making the beds, cooking the food, when I was a young fellow, and that's all changed now. So, well, and it has changed, and a recognition that there are some roles that you do not need to be in uniform to perform. We had a bad, I would say, we had a bad experience in the 90s where we said, right, well, who needs a cook in uniform? So we got rid of all that. And then we went into Timor, and then people said, oh, who's going to feed the troops? So we have corrected that, but not everyone who is in the kitchens is in the military, so there's a balance. And I'll give you another example from my, when I was the Strat J4, I'd go to the briefing, the Commander Joint Operations briefings once a month, and they'd do a run around the world and where the problems were and what our challenges are going to be, and I'd sit there and go, and it's always been thus, but I'd sit there and go, we do not have enough strategic lift. We do not have enough strategic lift. So, and we do not have enough strategic airlift, but also maritime. So, what you know, I'm thinking, well, we're not going to buy another how many C-17s, and we're not going to buy so many Hercs, etc. So then it was about, well, how do we augment it? You don't replace it, but how can you augment that capability through a commercial arrangement, which is what we did. And so it's, in my view, and I think this is how Defence still does it, it's about understanding operational risk, right? So at the beginning, right at the front, it's military, military, military. And when you get a stabilised environment, you can bring in contractors. And I think the Solomons was a good example of that, where the AFP actually led the operation, because the national assessment had been that the risk was such that that would be appropriate. You didn't need the full military force. AFP led. Certainly there was ADF personnel supporting that, and then there was a string of contractors that went in. It's so much going on that we do not have enough military people to do that. So it's about integrating, sometimes interfacing, integrating with the commercial sector, with defence contractors, and that whole ecosystem, if you like. That's a bit of a consulting term, but nonetheless, it's broader than. And so that's where you see in the National Defence Strategy from 2023 very much a focus on working with industry closer than we have in the past. And that's not just defence industries, but also national infrastructure. For example, I'm speaking here for Aeronautical Society, but if I was here with my hat as chair of the Australian Logistics Council, we actually sit on the National Fuels Council to represent industry. So, and that's co-chaired by Defence and Department of Energy and all the strings of letters. Why are we there? Because we saw in COVID, if you don't have logistics and supply chain happening, the bottom line, people, is you end up with toilet paper wars, right? And during mobilisation, and you're not allowed to use that word either, you've got to keep all of that civil apparatus working. You've got to feed the nation, you've got to have fuel moving, you've got to have all of that. So it's got to be all coordinated. So it is very different to just all in-house. But to enhance and expand the capacity and the capability of the Australian Defence Force, you need that, would be my answer. Even in the civilian commercial context,
for our council, I had a session with AI in logistics and what does it mean and what does it look like. And I won't talk about who the people who presented, but I wasn't very impressed with their understanding of where it's going and what's required and what are the, you know, for example, how do you make sure that that's great, and we can't shy away from it, I'm not saying that, but we've really got to embrace it, and we've got to understand where the risks are. So for example, you've just increased, you know, a zillion-fold the cyber risk introduced to your systems, and particularly cyber risks and attacks on operational technology, which is, in my mind, logistics infrastructure, you know, shutting down gas pipelines and utility grids and all that sort of stuff. So I think we're very much slow on the uptake. Ask me next year. But the other dimension is we have never and still do not meet our UN obligations for a 90-day reserve holding. Last count, I think it was, so a couple of months ago, it was 21 days. The downside of, and this is public stuff, I'm not talking anything I shouldn't talk about, shoot me. But unfortunately that includes inventory inbound. But that's a great segue to we could talk about sustainable aviation fuel, and that will help, well, for a whole bunch of reasons we should be, from the emissions perspective, but it's also not an entire, but one option for mitigating that fuel risk, particularly in the aviation sector.
We'd like to give you a memorabilia of aviation in Western Australia called the Forgotten Flyer.
Oh, fantastic, thank you.
And there is a little certificate of appreciation.
Lovely. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much appreciated. Thank you, Terry.